Okay, good afternoon, everybody, and welcome. Thank you for joining us today on this webinar about the Net Zero Carbon Building Commitment. This is the first in a series of webinars that will be presented by Emirates Green Building Council's Net Zero Centre of Excellence. My name is Lindsay and I'm the Education Officer at Emirates Green Building Council, and I'm just going to give you a very short introduction before we get started with the webinar. For those of you not familiar with Emirates Green Building Council, I'm just going to give you a brief introduction. So we're a not-for-profit organisation that was formed in 2006 to contribute to the UAE's goal to be a leader in sustainability in the built environment. The Council brings together organisations which share our mission and serves as a platform for collaboration and knowledge sharing. We run an education programme with events and training throughout the year that aims at raising awareness of green building practice and providing knowledge to build capacity here in the UAE and beyond. With this in mind, we're very pleased to bring you this series of webinars on the topic of net zero buildings in the UAE and beyond. Emirates Green Building Council established the Net Zero Centre of Excellence in January 2018 as a think tank and accelerator which aims to advance the net zero movement, which is happening internationally here in the UAE. As a member of the World Green Building Council, we are very proud to work closely with them on their Advancing Net Zero initiative, and I'm very pleased to be partnering with them today to bring you this webinar on the Net Zero Carbon Building Commitment. So launched by WorldGBC in 2018, the commitment challenges companies, cities, states and regions to reach net zero operations in their portfolio by 2030 and to advocate for all buildings to be net zero in operation by 2050. So today's webinar will provide you an overview of this commitment and give you the opportunity to hear from some of the organisations in the region which are already signed up and how it's supporting their net zero journey. So the agenda for today's webinar is on screen now. So we will first hear from Advancing Net Zero Director Victoria Burrows to give an overview of the commitment, before hearing from Maj Fayed, as the Technical Manager at Emirates Green Building Council, about achieving net zero here in the UAE. We'll then hand over to some of the signatories who are signed up. We're very pleased to have representatives here today from organisations that are very much leading the way in terms of sustainability in the region. We have Ibrahim Al-Zwabi from the developer Majid Tame, who was one of the first signatories to sign up to the commitment. Alan Fogarty from the consultancy Cundal, that has operations internationally, and Philippa Grant, Director at AESG, which is operating here in the region and beyond. We'll conclude the session with a moderated discussion and a Q&A with the audience, facilitated by Victoria. So the purpose of this webinar really is knowledge sharing, so please do submit questions throughout the presentations, and we hope to address as many as possible during the discussion. So just a couple of points before we get started. You can ask questions at any time during the webinar through the questions panel, which is in your control panel on the right of your screen. We'll share a recording of the webinar with you afterwards. And please follow us on social media and get involved using the hashtag EGBC webinars. So finally, just before I hand over to Victoria, if you do want to contact Emirates Green Building Council, the details are on the screen now, but the email address to remember is netzero@emiratesgbc.org. So I will now hand over to Victoria to begin our presentations in this webinar. Okay.
Great. Thank you very much, Lindsay, and hi to everyone. Thank you so much for your interest and joining this webinar today. As Lizzie mentioned, my name is Victoria Burrows. I am the Director of the Advancing Net Zero project from the World Green Building Council. And as very briefly mentioned already, World Green Building Council is a network of green building councils from across the world, of which Emirates is a very important valued member. So we have about 70 green building councils across our network, and the Advancing Net Zero project comes from the WorldGBC. So we launched the project Advancing Net Zero in 2016 when it was clear that we needed to move beyond net zero buildings, beyond green buildings into an offering from the network, from the industry that leads us towards net zero carbon buildings. I think I need the mouse control. Sorry, Lindsay, I don't have it just at the moment. And so we set a challenge to the network of green building councils to bring solutions to the market that would help drive uptake of net zero carbon buildings towards 100% by 2050. So, Advancing Net Zero is a global campaign to accelerate the uptake of net zero carbon buildings to all buildings, so 100% to be net zero carbon by 2050. And the key aims of the project are to increase the awareness and education around the urgency and achievability of net zero carbon buildings, and also to achieve alignment and commonality amongst approaches that green building councils take across the world through their programs and through their certification schemes and their rating tools. And then finally, to expedite uptake in global markets by sharing market leadership examples through forums exactly like this one that we have today. We have a framework for advancing net zero that sets out our vision. So our vision, as I mentioned, by 2050, all buildings will operate at net zero carbon. We also have an interim target that sets from 2030, new buildings should operate at net zero carbon. And as we'll hopefully hear from some of our panelists later in this session, it gives a greater opportunity to influence the design and the performance of buildings in new projects, and that's why we have that interim target. The WorldGBC set an umbrella definition for net zero carbon buildings that all of our green building councils can adapt and apply as appropriate for their particular context. But for us, we mean that a net zero carbon building is highly energy efficient, with all remaining energy coming from on-site and/or off-site renewable sources. We have several action pathways that green building councils can take towards achieving this overall goal. And one of those is corporate engagement and training and education, which is very much facilitated through this commitment. We have a series of principles to set a best practice approach, including, most importantly, we are talking about how buildings actually perform in operation. So not just their energy consumption, but where does that energy come from? What are the carbon emissions associated with that energy? And what is the actual performance data telling us about how that building is performing? The second is to prioritize energy efficiency to reduce energy wastage and energy demand. And then finally, to generate the renewable energy balance on site where possible, procure from off-site sources, and as a last resort, use offsets if that's necessary in your market. So there's a bit of flexibility around how you can achieve net zero. And then some of our green building councils are already extending that scope to include embodied carbon as a whole life approach, and other impact areas such as zero water and zero waste. So we have similar frameworks like this for addressing whole life carbon. The good news is, oh, gone too fast, sorry. The good news is that net zero is here. We are seeing solutions for net zero buildings popping up all over the world in different geographies, different climates, different building typologies. And we'll hear from some of our panelists about some of the solutions and strategies to achieving net zero on a building. But it was important for us to recognize that to achieve our mission, it's necessary to go beyond individual building level, and that we must be setting solutions and strategies and roadmaps to achieve net zero buildings at scale. So we know those solutions are possible now. How do we bring that to scale? We have roughly 1 billion buildings in the world. That's a huge number to achieve this target for. So the commitment was launched in 2018 to promote and inspire leadership action towards net zero carbon buildings. There are 5 components to the commitment. Firstly, it's the commit part. So setting an advanced trajectory for all new and existing buildings within direct control of your organization to operate at net zero carbon by 2030. So that's all your existing buildings in your portfolio that you own or that you occupy or that you are developing. And then also regulate for buildings to operate at net zero by 2050 if you are a city, a region, or a national government. The second component is disclose. So measure, disclose, and assess annual asset levels, so building level and portfolio energy demand and carbon emissions, and that will help you determine your where the opportunities are to reduce carbon emissions. And so then the third component is act. Develop and implement a decarbonisation roadmap outlining the key actions and milestones towards both energy efficiency and renewable energy to reach decarbonisation goals. The fourth component is to demonstrate enhanced energy performance and reduced carbon emissions to show progress towards those net zero goals within the buildings and at a portfolio level. And for that, the different Green Building Council rating tools can be used or third-party verification of your performance data. And then finally, think about how you as an organization can act as a catalyst through core business activities for further action within respective supply chains, whether you are a designer or a manufacturer or a developer. What are the opportunities presented through the work you do to further reduce those emissions and increase your impact as an organization? So to accompany the commitment, we have a detailed guidance document, and anyone interested in signing up can access it through the local Green Building Council. And it sets out lots of different guidance in best practice towards achieving some of the core elements of the commitment. So it sets out eligibility criteria, the scope of emissions. At the moment, we're focused on scope 1 and 2 energy related emissions. So that's the scope of the commitment for now, but we recognize where companies go beyond that in their reporting. Greenhouse gas accounting, how to approach data and performance gaps. There's lots of different sets of guidance within this document that will help you on your journey to achieving net zero portfolios. We currently have 82 signatories across the world, including several cities and states and regions that are committing to regulation. So it's really inspiring to see these organizations, these governments that are willing to not just commit, but commit to act. And it's very much an action-oriented initiative. In addition to the detailed guidance document, we have a series of pro formas and documents as part of the sign-up pack. And we leverage the power of our network of GBCs and their tools, their rating tools, their different resources to help you on your journey. Each company and government that signs up to the commitment must develop an action plan as part of the recruitment process to know what they intend to do against those 5 components that I just set out earlier. And here's an example. We'll see a couple more from some of the signatories that we have on the call today. But it shows how for each of those 5 components, this organization will develop a bespoke approach with the same intent as we set out in the guidance document to achieve a decarbonized portfolio for their operations. So the next steps, the recruitment process for the commitment, if you're interested, is to reach out to your local GBC and to Emirates GBC. The team there are very equipped with what's needed to sign up to the commitment. We are here at WorldGBC to support you as well along your net zero journey. The first stage is to determine your interest, to check your eligibility, and then the alignment of any existing strategies that you have to achieving net zero, and then look to sign up, develop the the marketing communications materials, including the action plan that I just outlined, and then announce your joining the commitment and your plans to achieve decarbonisation. So we're here and willing to help. The recruitment process does sort of coach you through the whole thing, so please do reach out if you're interested, and wherever you are along that decarbonisation journey, and join a growing community of businesses, cities, states and regions committing to make zero emissions in the built environment a reality. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much, Victoria. We're now going to hand over to Maj to deliver the next presentation.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you, Victoria and Lindsay. I would also like to welcome you all to our first webinar under the Net Zero Center of Excellence webinar series. Lindsay, I don't have access to the slide. Sorry, we have some technical issues, so bear with us.
Okay, Maj, you should have access now.
Okay. Okay. So my presentation today will focus on the net zero movement in the UAE, the definition of net zero energy or net zero carbon buildings, and the challenges and opportunities for the adoption and spread of such types of buildings in the UAE. Before I start, I would like to share with you some information about our net zero program. Let me see. I can't see it. The next slide, Lindsay. I think we'd better go from your.
Yeah, if you just let me know when you need to.
Okay. So in 2017, we've launched our net zero program by joining World Green Building Council's Advancing Net Zero project, and by publishing a first of its kind report on defining nearly zero energy buildings. Following the publication, and in 2018, we've established our Net Zero Center of Excellence as a platform for different stakeholders, including government, academia, and private sector, to share and learn more about net zero energy and carbon buildings. Next slide. The Net Zero Center of Excellence also aims to drive policy and regulations towards decarbonization. And it also offers tools and resources towards the advancement of net zero energy and net zero carbon buildings in the UAE. I'll be sharing some of these resources towards the end of my presentation, so please stay tuned. Next slide. As Victoria mentioned, we need to achieve net zero carbon buildings for all of our buildings by 2050. To help meet the Paris Agreement goals and to limit global warming by 1.5 degrees Celsius. However, in this part of the world, the challenge of mitigating climate change and limiting global warming by 1.5 degrees is higher, and as well as the consequences of climate change. According to the IPCC 2014 report, the Arab region is considered as one of the most vulnerable regions of the world to the impacts of climate change. The average mean change in temperature in Arab countries is expected to increase by 1.9 to 2.6 by the mid of the century. Next slide. UAE, as part of the Arab world, will be definitely impacted by climate change. Climate change will result in increase of temperatures across the UAE, climate projections predict a 2 to 3 degrees increase in the temperature during the summer months of 2060 to 2079. Humidity will increase by 10%. Precipitation, rainfall, as well, is predicted to increase by 50 to 100% in Dubai, Sharjah, and Northern Emirates. Moreover, the probability of severe extreme events and conditions is predicted to increase both in magnitude and frequency. So the UAE and the Arab world need to take rapid actions towards mitigating climate change and avoiding these harmful impacts of climate change. Next slide. The buildings and the construction sector play a very important role in helping reducing the carbon footprint, because buildings and construction sector account for 39% of the energy-related CO2 emissions globally. Unfortunately, we don't have figures and statistics related to the emissions from the building sector in the UAE or the Arab world. However, if we go to the next slide, we'll see that the UAE and buildings in the UAE contribute to have a very large energy consumption and due to the cooling load, and it is estimated that buildings contribute to 70% of the electricity used in the UAE, and 70% of this electricity used in buildings is used for air conditioning. According to the Federal Electricity and Water Authority, an average UAE residence consumes 25 kilowatt hours of electricity per day, compared to a global average of 15 kilowatt hours per day. Moreover, Emirates Green Building Council benchmarking reports highlight that there's a huge difference between the best building performers and the worst building performers in terms of energy and water consumption. Having said that, the building sector and the construction sector in the UAE play a very important role in reducing the country's ecological and carbon footprint. The UAE government has put concerted focus on buildings and sustainability in general through developing and launching several strategies and initiatives, such as the UAE Clean Energy Strategy, the Dubai Integrated Energy Strategy. New building regulations and retrofitting initiatives were also developed in the UAE and launched to reduce the environmental impact of both new and existing buildings. For new buildings, we have the Istidama rating system in Dubai, in Abu Dhabi. In Dubai, we have the Asafat rating system, Barjil in Ras Al Khaimah, and many retrofitting initiatives in Dubai, Abu Dhabi, Ras Al Khaimah, and Sharjah. Building on these initiatives, the UAE and the UAE government can really benefit from the concept of nearly zero or net zero energy buildings, and can benefit from designing, constructing, operating, and even retrofitting buildings to a net zero energy or carbon level. Next slide. What is a net zero energy building in the UAE? As per EmiratesGBC defining nearly zero energy report, we defined a nearly zero energy building, residential or office building in the UAE, as a highly energy efficient building with a site energy use intensity less than 90 kilowatt hours per meter squared. The building should cover a significant portion of its annual energy use by renewable energy, either generated on site or off site. Next slide. In 2019, we've partnered with the International Living Future Institute to deliver zero energy and zero carbon building certifications in the UAE. The definitions of the ILFI definitions for zero energy and zero carbon buildings were adapted for the UAE market based on our research, our definition, and based on a study conducted to understand the feasibility and applicability of the ILFI criteria for zero energy and zero carbon in the UAE. For a zero energy building, the building should achieve 100% of its annual energy demand by on-site renewables. Off-site renewables can be also considered for in specific situations and conditions for buildings that have a very high energy use intensity, or for buildings that have grid connection problem or issues. The zero carbon certification also requires 100% of the building energy demand to be met by renewables, but offers a flexibility in terms of the source of renewable energy, either on-site or off-site. There are other requirements for the zero carbon on the next slide. So the zero carbon certification also requires a minimum level of energy efficiency in the building, or a maximum energy use intensity. For new buildings, the maximum EUI should be less than 100 kilowatt hours per meter squared, while existing buildings should demonstrate 30% reduction of their energy use intensity compared to median EUI for the building typologies listed in the second table. For instance, a net zero school shouldn't consume more than 94 kilowatt hours per meter squared per year. The net zero carbon building certification also requires targets on embodied carbon. 10% of the total embodied carbon of the building should be reduced. The total embodied carbon should be less than 500 kilograms per meter squared, and the total embodied carbon should be offset through certified carbon credits, or such as CERs. Next slide. The challenges for the adoption and spread of nearly zero energy buildings in the UAE, according to our nearly zero energy report, here are the top challenges. At first, there's lack of awareness about the cost effectiveness of energy efficient buildings and green buildings in general, building occupant behavior, a lack of awareness about the importance of energy conservation, the UAE climate, a huge cooling load, lack of government initiatives specifically on nearly zero and net zero energy buildings, the capital cost of renewable energy systems, and in many cases, space limitations due to specifically for high-rise buildings. Next slide. With regards to the feasibility of nearly zero energy or net zero energy buildings in the UAE, we found that there are several projects that readily exist, and this demonstrates that the time is appropriate to transition from an early adopter state to mainstream adoption. Stakeholders agree that that we are ready to adopt the net zero energy concept between 2020 and 2030. It is recommended to start introducing the concept in public sector or in public buildings before rolling it out to the private sector. Any nearly zero energy building or net zero energy building or a nearly zero energy building action plan should be cost effective and hence focus mainly and at first on passive design measures. And at last, it is recommended to consider renewable energy beyond the plot of the building or offsite renewables to specifically when we have space limitations in high-rise buildings. Next slide. In terms of the resources, you can download our Defining Nearly Zero Energy report and the Building Efficiency Accelerator project report, which provides you benchmarks about the energy and water performance in hotels, malls, and schools. Both of these reports are available on our website and they are for free. Next slide. You can also visit our Net Zero Center of Excellence website page to learn more about the net zero movement in the UAE and to check more about the zero energy and zero carbon building certification requirements. Next slide. At last, I'm pleased to announce that we've partnered with BioNova to offer one-click LCA planetary embodied carbon tool for free for companies in the UAE. So the tool will be available by end of May. It will allow companies, designers and consultants to calculate material and carbon efficiency stages A1 to A3, and it also allows to compare different building materials during the design stage. and offers access to local EPDs and environmental product declarations. Next slide. One final word about the Net Zero Carbon Buildings commitment. Emirates Green Building Council fully supports the commitment and invites our members, partners, and industry partners to check the commitment and to join the movement. You can email us, as Lindsay mentioned, on netzero@Emirates Green Building Council or EmiratesGBC.org if you have any questions about the Net Zero movement or about the commitment as well. Thank you.
Okay, before we move on to the next speaker, we just have a couple of questions related directly to your presentation, Maj, with the UAE. And the first one is, do you think adopting a single regulation across the UAE would have an impact greater than the Emirates specific guidelines?
Definitely, yes. However, for buildings in the UAE and for new buildings or existing buildings, we've seen that every emirate has its own regulations and its own rating system. So hopefully we can, for net zero or net zero energy or net zero carbon buildings, buildings or projects, would you be using Emirates Green Building Council and ILFI zero energy and zero carbon certifications.
Okay, and then just one other question, because we have quite a few about the Al-Safat regulations here and by certification exams. So a lot of people asking about where they can find more information regarding that certification.
You can find them on the website of Dubai Municipality, or you can contact us. We can put you in touch with them, with their team.
Okay, great. So now moving on to our next speaker, the first of our signatories is Ibrahim Al-Zubi, from Chief Sustainability Officer for Majd Al Futtaim, who is one of the first signatories to sign up to the commitment. So I'm now going to hand over to you, Ibrahim. Hopefully this will work, but if you need to change a slide, then please do let me know.
Okay. Good afternoon, everyone. Ramadan Kareem for everyone who is ever fasting it or living the spirit of Ramadan, the giving and the kindness that we live during Ramadan, which we should live, I think, during the year. Also, I really wish each one of you and your families are well and safe and managing the COVID-19 crisis and getting the best out of it, although it's a whole challenge for the whole world, but I'm sure we are all being here together, so we are all in this together, even with the net positive. So I hope the spirit the world had to fight and combat and fight COVID-19 will be the same for climate change and the same passion we had to promote for net positive. Briefly, I would share with you today why we decided to go net positive and how, and maybe an update on the work in progress that we started a couple of years ago. We signed the commitment. We're one of 3 companies globally first signed this in Toronto, Canada, during the WorldGBC Congress, and then we thought that will be a challenge, but we knew, we were 100% sure that this is an enhance for the way we think of business. Next slide, please. The first thing I want you to know that at Majd Al Futtaim, sustainability is at the heart of everything we do. It's embedded within the day-to-day business. The business we know as the business we used to know is no longer exists for us. Sustainable business model is a main thing for us, and with all the 3 pillars: the planet, the profit, and people as well. So this is a main thing. I want you to keep it in the back of your mind in the next, when I start talking about the next slides. Next, please. You've listened to Victoria and Majd, and I'm sure you all know that globally climate change is a challenge for everyone, And also, if we talk about our region, I would add water, of course. So climate change and water scarcity in this part of the world is impacting our ability to deliver and live and deliver our vision as a company, from a risk and compliance, from the way we would like to be as a business in the next 20 to 25 years. One of the main two things we identified as challenges that we need to look at are climate change and water. Next slide, please. Our vision is to create great moments for everyone every day, and this is something we live and breathe. The 44,000 staff of Majd Futtaim implemented on a daily basis, even including on challenging time like the time we are living right now, and to ensure and to protect the great moments, we have to look at the environmental and social and economic impact. So we look at the prosperity in the region, not only for Majd Al Futtaim. Next slide, please. To enhance our great moments, we came up with a sustainability strategy. We call it Dare Today, Change Tomorrow, a way of life for a positive future. We decide in everything we do, we must be daring if we want to achieve our targets, and we should link it to our values, which is being bold and passionate and together. Next slide, please. We feel as a company that we have the responsibility to put more and back to the economies and to the environment than we take out to be net positive by 2040. The decision that we took, what's beyond being energy efficient or environment friendly or environment negative neutral, we decided we must, as a company, to be around in the next 20 to 25 years, that we must to put back into the environment than we take. Hence, we decided to be net positive by 2040. Next slide, please. So how we do get there? So net positive, as I mentioned in the previous slide, is we need to put back into the environment as we more than we take. Next slide, please. Thank you. We know that we can reduce carbon and water while creating more energy and water than we need. We made sure that in every design now, in all our thinking for the last 2 years and the coming years, that it's not only about carbon or water reduction, but also we need to think to link circular economy into the businesses, to the embodied carbon, to the way we run and operate our malls or our Carrefour stores or our cinemas. The whole thinking now is not, it's going beyond the reduction phase. It's going more into the creating more clean energy. Next slide, please. So we identified targets, but before the targets that we needed to identify, we measured our impact. We knew exactly, and we were transparent about it, the impact we have in energy and water, and why energy and water. When we did our study on our environmental impact, we found out that our mainly negative environmental impact is in carbon and water. Hence, we've decided that these are the two main parts that we would like to tackle, in addition to the waste, of course. So having a 2016 baseline, which is our main impact, and we decided by phases. The first phase will be a reduction on absolute carbon emissions by 37% by 2022 in both carbon and water. Next slide, please. Also, to make sure that the reduction is supported by renewable energy on-site generation, we come up with a commitment as well, aligned with the energy efficiency and reduction, which is a minimum of 5% of our energy consumption at any existing asset must be generated from solar PVs. And that's the minimum 5%. And for existing assets, 7.5%. So we launched, the first thing we've done is we shared and we communicated our impact. We knew our impact. We measured our impact so we can manage our assets. The first, in the next part, we put a short-term target of energy efficiency and water efficiency reduction, supported by a renewable on-site clean energy generation. Next slide, please. This whole thing with a whole map and an action plan from here to 2040, where we measured our operational footprint, development footprint, and tenant footprint. And based on that, we came up with a project plan from 2016 to reach 2040 on different phases. 2020 is the first phase with 37% reduction in carbon and water. 2030 is the second phase, where our operational footprint will be net positive by 2030, so beyond net zero. And when I say operational footprint, I mean all landlord areas, all the areas we own. By 2040, we will also include all our tenants, and developments will achieve net positive by 2040. The whole map you see in front of you is supported by key performance indicators and annual targets that is embedded of the annual KPIs of the staff, including the CEO of the company and the operations, where we are measuring it on a daily basis, monthly basis, and gets audited quarterly by a third-party auditor and gets communicated internally and externally. Next slide, please. Next, thank you. So this is the net positive is part of our SBCs, or sustainable business commitments. We highlighted a business commitment that is owned and sponsored by one member of the board of directors and the CEO of the OPCO, with a vision on to not only to implement it, but also to inspire others to help us to limit the climate change. So climate change for us is a risk, and we can't do it on our own. Our vision is to include all stakeholders and all partners. And under our main focus area on sustainability strategy, which is rethinking resources, the commitment is all our operating companies will become net positive in carbon for all operational tenant and developments. And this is, if you want to speak the international language, this easily serves SDG 7 and SDG 13. This SBC commitment is endorsed, approved, and reported to all board members and C-level and the shareholder. Next slide, please. Similar to water, there is an SBC on water that easily serves SDG 13, as well as with a long-term timeline, the one I shared previously in the last two slides. Next slide, please. One main thing I would like to highlight here, and Victoria mentioned it in the WorldGBC, to how to be net zero. Transparency is a main thing. Transparency shows you if you are doing well or not, and that's so important. And also it helps others to look at and inspire others, and at the same time to share knowledge. So when they see you have an issue in a specific area, sharing knowledge is so important. So we communicate with a lot of innovators globally that they are dealing with us, communicating with us because of our net positive commitment. So while doing that, we found out that we do have lots of in-house research R&D unit that we do when it comes to net positive. Hence, we've decided to have a commitment also to share our knowledge on the regional level and globally with WorldGBC and the GBCs on the national level. And we started sharing knowledge on as white papers. Every quarter we issue a white paper on how we've been doing it so far on a specific issue with a global background and the challenges we faced so far. That's an important thing we should highlight in the coming couple of years, that all organizations should do: transparency and sharing knowledge. Next slide, please. Highlights. This specific, I want to wrap up with a couple of slides to show that since we started the journey in 2016, it's been from we don't know if we'll achieve it or not, do we have the right technology or not, to the following highlights I'm going to show you. So can it be done? Absolutely. I've been asked this question many times when we started first the challenge. Can this be done? My answer will be maybe. Now I'm telling you yes. And the other we're living COVID-19, we have no choice. We have to. So the next slide, please. Since 2019 and more now, these numbers keep changing. We started producing clean energy on site from PVs, as well as we just closed soon. We had to push it because of the COVID-19 lockdown. Off-site generation in Jordan that will cover all our assets in Jordan. But this is what the numbers you've seen: more than 800,000 kilowatt hour a year from PV's generation on site. Also, what we've been doing so far on green buildings, on our net positive, helped the company to have access to capital, where we launched 2 rounds of green sukuk, 600 million each, and each one of them 4 times oversubscribed. The last one was late last year, where investors were looking for green assets, green sukuk to invest in, as well as the updated number. We have more than 2.4 million square meters of green accredited and certified floor areas across all our assets. Next slide, please. This is all what we've done from green buildings to PVs to off-site generations. It proves you that if the only solution we have when it comes to buildings is not only net zero, it's net zero and beyond. And this is something I want everyone hopefully to understand and support, that when you think buildings, the norm is to think green buildings only. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ibrahim, for that very informative presentation. So we're now going to hand over to our next presenter, Alan Fogarty from Cundal, who are a consultancy and Emirates Green Building Council member. So if I just hand over to Alan, and if you let me know when you need to change slide.
Okay, thank you. Next slide. Okay, so at Cundal, sustainability has been very important to us for quite a long time. We've been looking at sustainability really from the end of the 90s going forward, and we put some very serious effort into this around 2010 or so. Next slide, please. So around 2010, 2012, we started thinking about wider aspects of sustainability, and we became a One Planet company. So One Planet is a scheme set up by Bioregional, who's a charity, and the idea being that you have to live within the resources of One Planet, which is perfectly logical. And from that, we started measuring everything that we did, recording it in terms of energy and consumption of any kind of resource. And we were doing that for a number of years. And then around 2017, we had to renew our certification with Bioregional. So we went through a process saying, well, what's the next stage for us? And we did a materiality review as to what's important to us as an organization and where we can have the biggest impacts in terms of our activities. Next slide, please. So part of the materiality review helped us identify the key areas where we need to look at, and climate positive, zero carbon energy, health and well-being, ethics and equality, climate change adaptation, and material and supply chain were the key outputs from that activity. So these were the areas that we felt that we had the greatest ability to provide a positive impact. Next slide. So where we said we needed to focus was industry leadership, our projects, our workplace, and our homes and community. So industry leadership is activities like today. Our projects is where we potentially have the biggest impact, which can be the most difficult to deal with because it's a client who's actually paying us to doing this. So we don't have a control over it completely. Our workplaces where we had been focusing very much with the One Planet Living type thing, and our homes and communities is about encouraging staff to do the right thing themselves, to share learning, etc. And that's an area that we're continuing to move forward with. Next slide. So when the Advancing Net Zero program started, for us, it was quite a straightforward possibility for us to commit to doing this, since it was already on our agenda to deal with many of these things. So in terms of committing to occupy zero carbon buildings, we have a difficulty there in that we're tenants in pretty much all our buildings, so we're very much reliant on the landlord. But what we've said as of 2020, we're going to be zero carbon, so we're going to be offsetting our carbon, which is not an exercise that we take lightly because there's many offsetting schemes that aren't that robust, and we're going to have our scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions offset, and we're going to get it independently verified by the Carbon Trust. I seem to have lost my slides. And we're going to be carbon positive by 2025. And I think this particular crisis where we have to operate remotely from home is going to help us significantly with some of these things, because one of the areas for our carbon reduction is transportation, which is high due to flights, international flights. So being able to work like this makes it much more possible to avoid some of these things going forward in the future. Next slide. And within the business, there's been lots of innovation around sustainability. So we've been looking at health and well-being quite a lot over the last few years. We've developed productivity mapping tools. We've developed our whole life carbon capability. We work with the Greater London Authority developing the planning requirements for embodied carbon. We've worked with Hong Kong government to develop a tool for them to be able to get people to look at embodied carbon on their projects. We developed bespoke sustainability frameworks, recognizing that some of these fixed certifications can be quite rigid, not necessarily suitable for some clients. And we've done a lot of research into climate risk and resilience and how buildings then can be designed to overcome some of these risks. Next slide. And we've seen a revolution in the last year. So in the last 8 months, I'd say I've heard more about zero carbon than I've heard in the last 20 years. There's been a real acceleration, which has been tremendous. And we've seen all these demonstrations right around the world. And certainly in London, it's changed the way that organizations are thinking. When they've seen demonstrators up on the road, they realize they have to do something about this. And a lot is happening. Next slide. So one thing that's happened is the government here has said zero carbon by 2050. It's a legal requirement. All local authorities are saying that there's a climate emergency and they have targets of carbon neutral, some by 2028, 2030. Investors now requiring a lot more consideration and verification that people are taking these things seriously. A lot of developers here have signed up to zero carbon and they're looking to have their whole portfolio zero carbon by 2030. And we see occupiers to applying science-based targets. For us, we're saying that all our projects will need to have some kind of zero carbon, nature positive solution by 2022. So it's something that we're really going to start pushing. But it's not a hard push because we're finding our clients are very interested in this as a process anyway. Next slide. So, sorry, click again. So one of the things that we're doing is we're getting our design teams to think about how they actually go about doing this. And this is one of the most difficult things is because people tend to do the same thing as they did before. Next, hit again, please. So in reality, there is the same activities all the way through, but the point is it's about challenging the brief and challenging clients to do things differently. And click again. So these are the type of interventions that we're suggesting that need to go on when a design team is engaging. And it's about looking at reducing internal loads, relaxing set points, timber structures, optimizing daylighting, enable natural ventilation, reducing equipment sizes, variable speed controls, fossil fuel free. So it's about making sure that these conversations are happening at the right time within the project so that it can be embedded into the design and not try to retrofit it afterwards. Next slide. So we've set out our steps to net zero carbon. So there's 7 steps, and in the that's okay. You can go forward to the next one. I'll come on to the steps as I go through it. So next slide. In the UK, the Green Building Council had proposed these targets and a set of interim targets as well in relation to getting to this zero carbon standard. And here there's a target 70 or 55, depending whether you talk about net or gross. What I would say though, when you look at numbers like this, they're very useful because they give you something to aim for and they're demanding. So you really do have to start thinking about the building. But a building that's running 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, occupied 1 per 5. If it's running at 75, it may well be a far better building that's running at 70, but it's only being occupied 9 to 5 and 1 per 15 people in the building itself. So the numbers themselves don't in their own right tell you the full story. You need to look at actually how the building is being used. Next slide. And another aspect too is delivery, because you can design a building, but actually it may not be delivered well at all. And in Australia, there's the Neighbour scheme, which has been up and running for the last 20 years, and it goes through a very detailed analysis of buildings at the design stage, which is then used as a kind of blueprint as to how the building should be operating in the operational stage. So you can then accurately compare the ideal performance of the building with what actually is being delivered on site. And as a result, you can make sure that the contractors are going through the commissioning properly, that things are getting set up properly. And then the kind of performance gap that frequently exists between a design and a building in use starts to narrow. In the UK, we've just brought in that scheme and we're calling it Design for Performance. And all I can say is it's really important that buildings go through this as a process. It doesn't matter what target you set for a building. If you don't ensure you're getting it, then it's a complete wasted effort. And this process can reduce the energy consumption of a building by between 30 and 40%. Next slide. So in terms of the first step for zero carbon, to my mind, it's getting your daylighting right in the space. And many buildings are frequently not doing this properly. And it needs climate-based daylight modeling where you're looking at real metrics for quantifying whether the daylighting is right in the space. And what this tends to do is limit the amount of glass in the building, which then reduces solar gains as well. So that, to my mind, is the absolute starting point. Next slide. Natural ventilation where possible, and even in the Middle East, there's times of the year where it's perfectly pleasant outside that natural ventilation could work. It's certainly in Europe and in the UK, there's great opportunities to avail of this more. Next slide. And then looking at well-built, properly thought about buildings that are limited in thermal bridging, low infiltration rates, and really good U values. And that applies to any building anywhere in the world, whether it's naturally ventilated or not is irrelevant. It's about controlling what's happening, the interaction between outside and inside. Next slide. And then making sure that the actual loads in the building are right. So in the UK, we follow the British Council for offices. And on the left, you can see some of the allowances, 10 watts per meter squared for lighting, 20 to 27 for equipment. But in reality, we only want 4 watts per meter squared for your lighting and 10 for equipment. The result is you have systems that are grossly oversized and their part load performance is just not there at all. So we have inherently designed poor buildings because we didn't have the visibility on the loads. Then looking at alternatives to fossil fuels, so looking at heat pumps in buildings, looking at networks where you have low temperature networks and you're able to then use heat pump technology to provide cooling or heating to buildings as needed, but you're swapping the heat loads between buildings as well. So you're effectively recycling heat between buildings. And that's going to be a key point of getting to net zero carbon. Next slide. And then limiting the embodied carbon. So looking at alternative materials, looking at possibly timber as opposed to concrete, although that needs to be looked at very carefully because timber can be low in embodied carbon, but concrete can help lower the operational energy by reducing cooling loads within spaces. So that trade-off needs to be looked at. Next slide. And this is my last slide. And this is actually a really important element. So looking at the whole life of carbon is very important, but also looking at whole life costing. And to my mind, cost is a resource to a project. So for example, I mentioned timber as being an alternative material, but timber slabs in a building, CLT, is about 30 to 40% more expensive than concrete. So the question I would put to a design team is, yes, it's lower embodied carbon, but if you took that cash resource and you invested it in something else in the building, be it renewable energy, better control systems, etc., would you get a better carbon reduction than simply putting timber into the building itself? So this whole exercise of looking at whole life carbon is really important, but it can't be done in isolation to the actual cost itself. And getting those two balanced together, to my mind, is absolutely key in getting to zero carbon. Thank you for listening.
Alan, thank you very much for that presentation. So now we move on to our final presentation before our discussion. So I'd like to introduce Philippa Grant from AESG to talk about AESG's commitment.
Thank you, Lindsay. Hi, everyone. Thanks for having me today to talk about our experience with the commitment yeah, the commitment that we've made and how we're progressing since signing up last year. Do I have control of the slides or?
If you should do, but.
Okay, yep, I think so. So for those of you that don't know, AESG are a specialist consultancy firm that operate within the built environment. So we offer engineering, consultancy and strategic advice for anything within the built environment. So that can be on an individual building scale, a community or an entire kind of city scale project. So when we were also going through kind of a similar process as Cundal, considering what was important to us as a business, sustainability is at the forefront of everything that we do and has been since we started the company almost 10 years ago. And we decided that in line with kind of the development of the World Green Building Council's programs, we really wanted to start seeing what we could do to contribute towards the net zero movement. In 2019, the report was issued by more than 11,000 scientists that were declaring a climate emergency. We obviously paid attention to that. And as Matt mentioned earlier, there's a slight lag on the slides. Energy consumption by buildings makes up a huge portion of the overall energy consumed globally, and within the UAE, that's kind of our consumption is about double that in Europe. So when you're looking at the building consumption within the UAE, it's a significant portion of the overall consumption, and something that we have kind of a direct impact on being consultants within the built environment. So just to give a bit more information around the commitment that we've made as signatories to the Advancing Net Zero commitment. We've committed to becoming net zero across all of our own assets. So we do own a few of the offices that we are located within, but as Cundal are, we're also tenants in a lot of the offices. So we're fairly limited on the impact that we can have within the buildings that we're tenants in. However, we are going to offset all of our carbon, scope 1, scope 2, and also considering our operational scope 3 emissions. So looking at things like transport for work, flights, potentially the commuting into the office as well, which we're currently exploring if we can offset that. So we're trying to broaden the scope of the emissions that we're hoping to offset to capture more of our operational impact. In the offices that we own, we'll be certifying based on kind of green building regulations. At the moment, that's been LEED Gold. For commercial interiors, it could be the LEED standard, it could be an equivalency, whichever we feel is kind of most relevant at that time. And we'd like to move forward into using more of a performance-based rating system, such as the LEED ARC platform, which will monitor our actual performance rather than just purely the design performance of our spaces. We'd also like to start looking into promoting the installation of renewable energy on buildings where we either own a small portion of the building or where we're tenants, seeing if we can work with the building owner to see if there's an option to install renewable energy on those buildings, and see if we can somehow contribute towards that and start having a direct renewable energy supply to our offices. We'll also be disclosing our performance. So we publish an annual sustainability report that's available on our website. It will include full disclosure of our carbon footprint, our progress towards the commitment that we've made, and as well as a lot of other initiatives and CSR related activities that we do as a company. Rather than just kind of committing and reporting on the performance, we also want to act. So we don't want to just offset, we also want to actually reduce the carbon associated with our operations. So we're looking at targeting a 5% annual reduction in our emissions. At the moment, obviously with the coronavirus situation, we've managed to do fairly well on that, since we're not currently consuming an awful lot of energy in the offices, and we're not traveling. So I think this year we should be able to report quite a significant reduction. Next year it might be a bit harder once we're all back in the offices. So we'll try and take some lessons learned though from this period, and see if there's a way that we can kind of take positives out of the current situation and how we can start applying them. Maybe we'll try and support more remote working, more work from home, to help reduce kind of our overall emissions across our offices, which will be interesting to explore. So verifying, as I mentioned, that's going to be through the LEED certifications or equivalent certifications. And we're hoping, well, already all of our owned assets are certified, but we're hoping to move to the performance-based platforms. And then finally, the part of the commitment which we have focused most of our time and effort on is the advocacy piece. So we could have the biggest impact, similar to Cundal, on the projects that we're working on. Whilst we have a few of our own offices, we work on hundreds of projects every year. And if we can use that position in our projects to promote net zero principles and to get the principles adopted across more of these projects, then we can have a much wider impact across our portfolio. So our main kind of approach to the advocacy piece is we're going to be providing a pathway to net zero. We've started providing this for all of our design projects from this year forward. We basically will be developing a pathway at the earliest stage in the project possible, whether we're brought on during the initial briefing stage. Obviously that's the best time to look at these principles and how they can be applied throughout the project development. But even if we're brought on during kind of midway design stage, we can still do a review of the existing design and see how it can be kind of adjusted or developed to adopt more of the net zero principles. So to do this, we're looking at both the operational and the embodied carbon. So we don't want to limit it purely to the operational carbon. We basically will assess each of the designs or the project briefs, identify kind of the business as usual case. And then for operational carbon, we'll be going through the process of looking at kind of optimizing the massing and orientation, applying more efficient building envelopes, more efficient HVAC systems, efficient lighting, iterations basically of each of the design stages to generate the kind of optimum near zero energy building. And then how can we offset the remainder of that energy, ideally by installation of renewable energy within the site, or if there is an off-site potential, and then finally offsetting if required. For the embodied carbon, we've taken the same approach. So we'll take the project brief or the design, depending on what stage we're brought on board, consider the business as usual approach, and then we'll go through the iterations again of looking at how we can reduce the embodied carbon. So typical stages for that would be looking at optimizing the structure, the substructure and the superstructure to reduce the amount of material that you're having to put into the building, increasing the lifespan of the materials and the construction wherever possible, so reducing the need to replace materials, specifying and locally sourcing low carbon materials, which could be timber or more natural material options, and then considering the end of life, so looking at things like modular construction where you can reuse systems, and finally carbon offsets to offset the embodied carbon. I'm aware that we're a bit tight on time, so I might just even wrap up there if you want, Lindsay. It's I only had a couple more slides, but it just discusses the development of the pathway a bit more. But maybe you'd rather go on to the panel discussion.
No, that's great. Thank you, Philippa. And maybe we can, hopefully some of the other questions that we'll have in the discussion will allow you to address some of the other points. So thank you to all the presenters. We've had lots and lots of questions. So I'm going to hand over to Victoria to try and cover some of these in the discussion, and then we can hopefully follow up on some of the other questions after the webinar. So Victoria, I'll hand over to you.
Great, thank you very much, Lindsay. And yeah, I think we can come on to an embodied carbon question, Philippa, so we can hopefully delve a bit more into that pathway. But I think sort of sticking with the operational carbon focus for the moment, we have had a huge number of questions, so fantastic for all of you for getting involved, and please do keep them coming. I think we'll find a way to respond to as many as we can after the session as well. But there's lots of questions around some of the practicality of achieving some of these targets, and I know that you went into some of that detail, Alan, but a bit of an open question to all of the panelists to start us off with. One of the components of the commitment that's really important is the verify piece, so demonstrating that progress and actually checking how you're doing against and the progress you're making against the targets that you're setting, and assuring that performance data as well, and sort of going through the process of having it checked through a third party. And so I wondered if all three of you have kind of touched on it briefly within your presentations about why performance is important, and maybe we can just expand on that a bit as to why assurance is also key to make sure that you're on that pathway, and how therefore it supports your strategies, the strategies of your business towards net zero. I was going to start with Ibrahim, but we've just lost him. So maybe I'll come to you, Alan, if you wouldn't mind.
Yeah.
Oh, you're here?
Hi, I'm listening.
I know you have a specific approach to assuring your performance data.
Yeah, we do the assurance, and I have to say, assurance, although the assurance process, as from a sustainability perspective, you'll have it there, but you need to formalize it and make it official internally and externally. Internally, mainly with other departments. But since we've started issuing green sukuk, one of the commitments we had and we agreed with Treasury and the finance team and the Treasury team mainly with the investors, that we will have an assured report, assurance on the data, and this also raised another point for us, which is the ESG rating. So it started with a discussion, and the assurance was the audit, of course, is the main part of it, because this is where you get a third party informs your board, your CEO, about the performance of the asset and the team. But mainly the assurance also, it helped us with our ESG rating. We have 2 ratings with MSCI and Sustainalytics, and we scored A and low risk there, and it became the new norm as well. So we're at BBB rated company. Now we don't say that. We say we aim to be BBB with an ESG rating, even better every year. So assurance is the main thing for us now, and it is helping a lot the net positive. Although it was not triggered by the net zero, net positive, by the way. It was triggered mainly by the ESG rating and the green sukuk commitments to our treasury. But it helped us a lot to formalize the performance within the team, the sustainability team themselves, and the operations. That's from our experience. So I highly recommend it. It's a pain. It can start with a pain because you need to make sure by time, so it's but eventually it will help and it will speed the process to achieve your targets.
Okay, so coming to Alan and maybe Philippa as well. As designers, Alan, you mentioned specifically around performance management and designing for performance. Is there a way that as designers you can help facilitate the access to that information so that you can monitor the performance of the buildings more effectively?
Well, as I said in the presentation, the starting position for me is making sure that you're looking at real numbers in the first instance. And a lot of kind of calculations that are done at design stage are based on regulation, minimum standards, etc. And they aren't necessarily realistic. It's just about compliance. And I think we need to have a far more rigorous process whereby we're actually doing proper calculations to look at how systems will actually respond in buildings in use itself. And if you don't know the extent of the problem, then it's very hard to fix it. And the problem with energy is not very visible. So if you do that at the design stage and you allow that then to inform all your decisions right through to construction, then you have the theoretical best performance of the building. And then when you look at how the building is operating afterwards, you can see what errors were made, if you like, in terms of design assumptions, etc. So the whole feedback loop that goes into all this suddenly becomes hugely beneficial, and designers then can see what is really driving the energy performance of buildings. And generally, that closing of the loop doesn't happen nearly enough to benefit the whole industry. I see that as being a key element going forward.
So it's really interesting you mentioned that, Alan, because we can touch immediately on a question that I was going to bring to Philippa as well. There's a question here about when we talk about green buildings and introducing light or as much as natural daylight as possible into the building, how can we do that without impacting the heat loads of the building, which might then lead to larger cooling loads? And how can we find the right integrated design strategy for those buildings that helps achieve those goals, but also keep costs down as well?
If you use the right metric for daylighting, which is probably UDI, useful daylight index. So a useful daylight means that you have a maximum limit as well as a lower limit, and the maximum limit will be between 2,000 and 3,000 lux depending on the building type. Because if you go above that, then people just pull the blind down and you no longer have views outside, you no longer have daylighting. And what we have found certainly in the UK is that limit in terms of glass is around 30 to 35% of the facade as viewed from the inside out, which is less glass than you would normally put into a building. So the point being then, you've immediately dealt with one of the biggest problems in terms of solar gain as part of that process. So if you get your daylighting right, that is, to my mind, the first step towards a well-designed green building.
Yeah, excellent. Thank you, Alan. And so to sort of extend that question, Philippa, you mentioned the net zero pathway, which I think is a fantastic way to engage and educate your clients on how to take a building that they mainly already envisaged into something that could be a net zero building as well. We've got some questions here about, so firstly, the most significant areas to address to reduce carbon emissions. And I think through that step approach, you kind of started to touch on that in terms of where the greatest saving energy, saving potential, where the greatest energy savings and therefore carbon emission savings might be in the building, and so how you kind of bring that into a conversation with client, which will inevitably lead to the cost consideration as well.
Yeah. The cost question always comes up. The best thing is to have it integrated at the earliest stage. So when you're looking at the passive design measures, that's your greatest opportunity to reduce the energy consumption of a building with minimal to no cost to the client. If you passively design the massing, the orientation of the building, the windows, all of the glazing correctly in the first place, then you're naturally reducing the cooling load and the energy demand of the building without having to expend any more capital costs, so without having to install kind of high cost systems. So that's definitely the first place to start. There's really, amazing software that's coming online and really exciting work being done around the kind of digital design, optimization and computational design, which is helping a lot with more iterative approaches and really, really fast analysis and managing to iterate a lot of different options within a small amount of time and to assess the performance of buildings at that upfront stage. So I think definitely using the right software, using the right technology to help analyze the buildings is also kind of a very cost-effective way of improving the design as you go through. And yeah, I think building on what Alan was saying, again, using software to assess performance rather than relying on kind of manual calculations or theoretical assessments. Dynamic modeling really provides you a much more accurate assessment of a building during the design stage. However, it needs to be properly set up. All of the inputs need to be input correctly. You can't just use default values for everything, otherwise it's not an accurate representation of how that building is going to be operated. So yeah, that's definitely the most cost-effective way to address energy consumption is through the passive design measures at the upfront stage.
Great, thank you, Philippa. Anything to add there, Alan?
Yeah, I would also say what's a useful thing to do is to map all the potential energy flows in a building and see where they are going. And you potentially will find opportunities. For example, if there's catering in a building, then you generally have quite a lot of heat gains, and potentially rather than just cooling that and dumping that heat to outside, you might be able to reuse it for hot water systems or something like that within the building itself. The same thing can go with retail, etc. So it's making sure you understand exactly what's happening in the spaces, and rather than just having areas that would be kind of a tenant fit out that is kind of ignored by the engineers. They just provide power and possibly water to these spaces. They should actually engage with the fit out itself to understand how it's going to work as one system within the building itself, not to have these things just done in isolation. So we need a better integrated approach to these things.
Yeah. So once again, data and integration, holistic approach, I think this is coming through very strongly. So Ibrahim, I have two very big questions for you that I'm going to combine into an even bigger question. We have lots of questions about the solutions that Majida Fatem are implementing to achieve your net zero goals. You mentioned the 5% on-site energy and the 7.5% on-site energy for new projects. There's questions here about how you bridge that gap between the performance of those buildings and your net zero targets by 2030, and if there are off-site solutions, renewable energy solutions that you've employed in order to achieve that. And I think possibly linked, there's questions about regulation. So in order to achieve some of those and implement some of those solutions, what regulatory challenges have you come across and how have you overcome those in order to achieve your goals as an organization? I think we need you unmuted.
Yes,
there we go. Yeah.
When you said two big questions, you freaked me out. I thought, I wanted to use Ramadan as an excuse, say, take it easy, I'm fasting. But I'll be more than happy to answer these two questions, which are two good main questions, and thank you for the person who asked the questions. One, yes, we are looking at offsite. Actually, we looked at, and we're still at different solutions from storage batteries. We talked to different global, small, big companies on different solutions and implementing. We do implement lots of pilots, by the way. And the good thing about our company is we have a diversified kind of assets, from a cinema to a supermarket to a big mall, a small mall, to even a ski slope. So this is our big lab. So we did try lots of pilots, and now one of the solutions we started looking at, offsite generation. Jordan was the first option because of the which is related to your second question, because of the easiness of regulations there. It was a bit easier for us to negotiate with an SME to partner with them to cover more than 90% of our operations in Jordan when it comes to Carrefours from an offsite generation, where we signed with them for 20 years, which one saved us money. Electricity is expensive in Jordan, and that was before the oil prices went down. So I'm sure now that SME, they're so happy with that oil prices, and they're making good money. They won't be SME anymore. But mainly, we did save money in the long run. We did help the environment, and most importantly, it was a pilot for us across the countries we operate in. Does offsite work or not? So Jordan was a great example for us, and now we're looking at different countries, Egypt next, wherever we are, hopefully. And this is all linked to the regulations. Regulations always, Majd talked about, there was a question for Majd, why 7 different regulations while you can have one? Absolutely, but the amazing thing about green buildings, the principles are the same. We talk about energy, water, and different things, so it's different credits. So for us, we did not wait for regulations. The decision to have green assets, for example, in 2010, when I put the policy, anything we build must be LEED Gold or BREEAM Very Good or equivalent. That equivalent part is that national or different regulation. So the basic, the high umbrella was there. Now, do we struggle? Absolutely. Who said it's going to be easy? No one. Nothing is easy. You know, people are fighting for our health. We have front runners now. We have frontliners fighting for us, and it's never been easy. So look at it from agility, from resilience as sustainable. You have to go and work. You have to talk to act as a sounding board with the regulatory firms. Eventually, the good thing about when I put the slides, the link to SDGs, the SDG is the language we use with the government. All governments, most of them, 99%, I would say, they signed for Paris Agreement, and they have an SDG commitment. So you can feed into the SDGs. Things are changing, regulations are changing. And that's a good news, Victoria, about post-COVID-19. Listen, we will get over COVID-19. But you know what's the good news after post-COVID-19? Life will be different. People will listen to people like us more. Because if you look at what's happening now, what caused COVID-19 is the climate change and environment, the lack of environment support. So things will be better. And if it's not, that won't be smart for governments or for all the stakeholders. So things should get easier. Now, from regulations, again, it's a two-way, it's a long term. Hence, you have 2025, 2030, 2040. But it's definitely part of the challenges. Hopefully, back to the first point to wrap up is hopefully we will see even different solutions other than offsite and PVs, hydrogen, for example, storage, maybe. So we're open. We're on this together. You know, we're learning together as well.
Yeah, thank you so much. And I think that's really the solution, is to look at the solutions that are available now, even going back to the basics from a passive design point of view, and then looking ahead to providing resilience to those buildings for future regulations, maybe designing a building to accommodate more on-site solar in the future, for example. You know, maybe that's a way forward. So we've got lots of questions coming in about specific engineering solutions, and I would encourage you to reach out to our speakers after the call with some of those questions. Great that there's so much detail in those questions. A couple of other questions around broader scope, things like incorporating scope 3 emissions and embodied carbon as well. I'd encourage you to look at a report that we launched last year called Bringing Embodied Carbon Upfront, which I think all the panelists were involved in some way as well. So encourage you to take a look at that for some best practice guidance. And then again, lots of questions on certification and training on net zero buildings within the Emirates, and I encourage you to reach out to EmiratesGBC with some of those questions on that as well. So I'll wrap up there. Thank you very much to all of our panelists, and I'll bring Lindsay back in to close the session for us. Thank you, Lindsay.
Thank you, Victoria.
Thank you very much, Victoria, and thank you to all of our speakers today for joining us and sharing your experience and knowledge of net zero in the region. I think we're very lucky to have a network we can draw on to kind of share this knowledge with other organisations. So I'd also like to thank everybody who's attended this webinar and for submitting all of the questions. We had a huge volume of questions, too many to get through on this webinar. So we will be following up after this and sharing some of the resources that have been mentioned during this webinar so that you can find out more information. And as Emirates Green Building Council, we have your contact details, so we will look to follow up where we can on some of the specific questions. And I would also encourage you to visit our website and the Net Zero Centre of Excellence, where you can find some of those resources mentioned. So as we said, this is the first in a series of webinars which we'll be hosting on net zero, and our next one will be next week, next Tuesday, and it'll be looking at energy modelling for net zero buildings and hosted by Bureau Happold. So I would encourage you all to follow us on social media, where we'll be making announcements, and you can find out where to register to attend some of these other webinars whilst we're all at home. Yeah, hopefully you'll join us again. So thanks again to all of our speakers, and goodbye, Ramadan Kareem, and have a good rest of your week. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.